a drive way back. It might be. It could be. It is. Holy cow. Welcome to another broadcast of Bricks Behind the Ivy.
Hey, Cub fans, welcome to another edition of Bricks Behind the Ivy. I am your host, as always, Jeff Candy Cubs Rogowskis, and last week you may have noticed there was no Bricks Behind the Ivy, but don't worry, I was not traded by Jed Hoyer for a relief pitcher to be named player. I'm actually still here. I spent some extra time processing the moves the Cubs have made to make an extra special episode for you today as the smoke has now cleared. Welcome to another episode, and if you've been watching us long enough, you know that we start with the box score Blitz, and we have switched up the format. We're going to take a look very quickly in this week's box score Blitz, the transactions that happened at the trade deadline for the Cubs, who they acquired and who ended up leaving the team, and also a quick recap of the 2 home series in August, the 4-game set versus the St. Louis Cardinals, and the 3-game set versus a very talented Minnesota Twins team. So let's get started, guys. 3, 2, 1. Take me out to the box score Blitz. Go. The Cubs were pretty active at the trade deadline, but not as active as many people had thought, because there was a lot of thoughts that this team was going to be selling. Well, guess what? They didn't necessarily sell. They didn't necessarily buy. We don't know exactly what they're doing. They're threading that needle as always. And as to no surprise, it's still very, very confusing as what the Cubs are trying to do if they're trying to compete this year, which they have a very slim chance of making the playoffs, or if they're trying to build towards 2025. The first trade of this season was the Cubs traded for Nate Pearson from the Toronto Blue Jays. He's got a high-end fastball, and he has looked pretty good in general for the Cubs, as he has turned in a few good outings at this point, besides the hit batter out in Cincinnati, which is a little bit weird. But the Cubs got rid of Hendrik Panago in that deal, who was going to need to be added to the Real 5, and getting a guy like Nate Pearson, who's got a plus fastball and has a very similar profile to Julian Merriweather, could be a really nice add for the Cubs for their bullpen next year. The big trade was Christopher Morel and Hunter Biggie Ty Johnson going to the Tampa Bay Rays for Isaac Paredes. Paredes and Morel actually were part of the same international free agent class, and were both signed by the Cubs, are both 25 years old, and both third basemen. Well, both third basemen is a strong word. Juggles the Clown is one of them. The other one is a pretty solid defender. Isaac Paredes has an interesting baseball savant profile. If you want to take a quick look, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see it on the screen now. But he's got a lot of pull side power. He doesn't strike out a lot. He does walk. He makes pretty decent contact, and he is an average defender, which is significantly better than Morel. This is the first gutsy move by Jed Hoyer in what feels like a really long time, as he is taking a real gamble here on buying a better floor instead of waiting on Christopher Morel's ceiling. The last trade the Cubs executed was with the New York Yankees in Jack Neely and Ben Cowles for Mark Leiter Jr. Cowles is actually hurt. He'll miss the rest of the season having surgery for his injury, and Jack Neely is now at AAA Iowa, and he is the closer. He got his first save at AAA the other night. He's a tall right-hander. He's got some funk, and he will be an interesting part of this bullpen. So the Cubs played 2 series while we were away, and it was a 4-game set versus the St. Louis Cardinals, and immediately followed by a 3-game set versus the Minnesota Twins.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Twins, Basil. Twins.
So not the easiest stretch after the trade deadline, as the Cubs are looking to put together some wins and make this season interesting. And guess what? They delivered. They ended up taking 3 of 4, almost 4 of 4, except for a draft fly ball that ended up losing the game. But I digress. 3 of 4 from the St. Louis Cardinals to then come back and take 2 of 3 versus the Twinkies. really nice effort here by the Cubs. They've had some really solid pitching. They've had 4 quality starts in that stretch of 7 games, which is really, really nice to see. That is the Cubs' MO. And offensively, the player of the week for the Cubs is Bush Bay. I love Michael Bush. He hit 3 home runs in the span with 5 RBIs, with 346 on base, 667 slugging, and a 178 weighted runs created plus. Awesome. Just absolutely awesome. And on the pitching side, Cubs got a lot of good pitching. They got a quality start from Jamestown Tyone, Kyle Hendricks, Justin Steele, and Shota Imanaga, including a 10K performance for Shota Imanaga. So it's hard not to name Showtime our pitcher of the week, and that is the box score Blitz. So the trade deadline. I think we all got hung up on the definition of, are the Cubs buyers or are the Cubs sellers? And I knew they were going to thread the needle. That seems to be what the Cubs have been trying to do for the better part of the entire Ted Hoyer era, is thread the needle, whatever that may need. And I think it's extremely difficult to try to compete and build up a farm system unless you're hitting on every free agent signing, which the Cubs have not. If we talk about their payroll, which is something the Cubs and folks have talked about around the Cubs, is how big their payroll is and how few wins they're really getting out of the $230 million they're nearly spending on this team, and the AAV of Dansby Swanson's contract being higher than Bryce Harper's current AAV, and the missed opportunity there to get Bryce Harper a few years back. But really, it's swinging and missing on guys like Trey Mancini and Tucker Barnhart, paying too much money to Drew Smyly. That really is kind of hurting this team. I wanted to get another opinion and talk about this, and I brought on Evan Altman of Cubs Insider, D. Evan Altman on Twitter, to talk to me about the trade deadline, and he makes a great comparison to buying solid but replaceable headphones versus buying high-end headphones, and I thought it's great. You'll hear it towards the end of the interview. But before we get to Evan, I do want to stop and celebrate Wrigleyville Sports. Wrigleyville Sports is a proud sponsor of Bricks Behind the Ivy, and I just saw they've got their Bears stuff coming in. Yes, if you're watching Hard Knocks, no free ads, and you are excited about the other Bear in Chicago, the Chicago Bears, not just the baby Bears, the Chicago Cubs, check out Wrigleyville Sports for your Caleb Williams jerseys, for all your Bears needs. And heck, while you're there, pick up some extra Cubs stuff. You know you've been good. Use discount code IV10. Yes, it's changed from the past. IV10 for 10% off at checkout. And thank you so much, Wrigleyville Sports, for continuing to be a sponsor. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Evan Altman around stuff he's been doing, how he got into Cubs Insider, and most importantly, our thoughts on the future of this team and how we thought the trade deadline went. Take a look. All right, Cub fans, thanks for sticking around today. We have from Cubs Insider, Mr. Evan Altman. Thank you so much for joining us today on Bricks Behind the Ivy.
Yeah, glad to be here. It worked out well because the Cubs played earlier, so I'm not distracted by a game. But I am watching the Olympics, so there's like the mix. It works out really well because the Cubs played early. Now I can watch my Olympics without having to flip back and forth, so it's perfect.
Yeah, I've struggled mightily with not seeing spoilers during the day, and the primetime show, that has been I did not realize the one wasn't live the first night I watched, and I'm like, wait, I already read these results on Twitter this morning.
Right.
And so that has been an adjustment. So I've muted some phrases so I could enjoy some of the events a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I will say it's kind of there's a good bad to it. Although part of it's I figured out, I think, the ideal way, because I watched it. I've been watching it in prime time, and then I watched it over the weekend when I was able to watch all during the day, and it was a bit of a buzzkill because when you're watching it live, you got to wait for scores to come in. You got to wait between these heats. It's like, wait a minute, why is it taking so long? And it's like, oh yeah, dummy, because you're watching it all edited. Although I will say, the best thing. So we were watching last night. I have YouTube TV. We flipped over once Hard Knocks came on, so I could watch the Bears Hard Knocks episode. We made it through like 30 minutes of it because it was kind of late. And then when I flip back, I realized like YouTube TV just pauses it right there. I'm like, man, this is even better because not only was it prime time and it's quicker, and I could just zip through all the commercials. I was like, oh my God, like I was like, I should do this with baseball, but I can't. I already know, like I'm seeing too much of what the results are. But man, it would be wonderful to be able to just zip through the commercials, watch the game. That's it. Move on. Done. But alas, first world problems.
So here's a perfect transition and just an awful dad pun, but hopefully this conversation is as good as gold, just like the U.S. gymnastics and other athletes today. But yeah, I think a tradition for our guests, and I was lucky to meet you last year as part of an article for Northside Baseball, but I like to ask the question for the podcast, how did you get into the Cubs? And tell us a little bit about Cubs Insider and what you've been doing over there and how long you've been doing that.
Yeah, sure. So, I assume my story is similar to most of those of us of a certain age, to where, like you said, we're talking about watching TV on a DVR or through a streaming service, which is just unthinkable, right? So I grew up watching, really the 84 team was kind of the first memory I had of it, especially because they were actually good that year, right? The Cubs had few and far between were the good records, but grew up in the middle of nowhere, and we had like 4 stations, and you pull a couple of radio stations, so we got mostly stuff out of either South Bend or Chicago. I was in Northwest Indiana, and so that's what, my dad was a Cubs fan, his dad was a Cubs fan, my grandparents on the other side, my mom's side, were Cubs fans, and so we'd have the games on all summer, and that's just what you got used to. So I was more or less born into it, and then indoctrinated into it because there was, quite frankly, nothing else on television during the afternoon when you're a kid. Like, what else are you going to watch? Okay, it's Cubs baseball. And there were a lot of us like that, I think. And so, that sort of, that grew and got a lot of other favorite teams in various sports or whatever, but the Cubs have kind of been the one, kind of the North Star, if you will. And, just kind of went along with that. And then as time went, and this is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 12-ish years ago now. It was right around 2010, 2011, I guess, when I started to get into it. And just, was reading as one does, you're looking at stuff online. At the time, Yahoo was kind of I know obviously there's still a pretty big source, but that was like the primary kind of catch-all source, right? And you get all your news, your sports there, and they had a contributor network deal where you could just be a rando and sign up, and there was a little bit of editorial oversight, but not much, and I wasn't real pleased with what I had seen there, and I found myself, like I would consider myself to be a tremendous jerk these days based on what I had done, and I was making some kind of critical comments, and I was like, wait a minute, this is not who you are. Like, why are you criticizing this person? They're out there trying to do this. If you have a problem with it, then go out and do it better. Like, don't just create a problem without a solution. So I did, and worked on that for a while, and they shut that thing down. And then, to put it in a nutshell, just a few things kind of happened, bounced around, and then we started up Cubs Insider, and that has kind of evolved in a couple different directions into what it is now. And so, so been going at it for a while, and just kind of ideally trying to provide as much sort of editorial Cubs content, I guess, from my perspective. I like to try to analyze things or twist stuff around and have a little fun with it as best I can, along with traditional game recaps and, lineup kind of previews of the games and that sort of thing. So try to mix it around and have as much fun with it as possible, which, this year has been a little bit more trying. There's a certain point at which I think you just, we do this because we love it, but then there are certain times when it's harder to love than it is at others, and so I'm just looking forward again to. There's a lot of these young guys coming up. Looking forward to kind of seeing how this team evolves itself, and kind of covering that and finding out, can they eventually actually thread the needle that Jed Hoyer keeps talking about. So so that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, I think that's one thing, I definitely empathize with. I think this has been it feels like a weird like matching season of last year, but it feels worse than when they were running last year in July, and it has not been consistent. They've been bit by the injury bug. There's just been a litany of problems in the echo chamber that is Twitter, and from what I see from your tweets from time to time, the comments section of your website. I think that I have this sense, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are, that the fan base has changed. Obviously, 2016, brought what everybody was waiting for. But now I feel like there's this huge void of what's next. And there seems just to be a much larger contingent of frustration and anger than there is enjoyment of the team, as, now that they've done the thing, trying to figure out what they are. And is the ownership greedy? Is Wrigley Field too expensive? Like the questions that people didn't ask because they wanted to be part of a conversation, they're now asking a lot. And it's very, very different.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this mix of like, on one hand, fans are, at least a certain cross section of fans are much more savvy to the goings on, right? And we could talk about that being advanced metrics. We could talk about that just understanding how payrolls work and seeing how maybe the Cubs do things versus other teams. There's a lot more transparency, even though we will never know truly the inner workings from a financial standpoint. There's just more transparency or more enlightenment maybe in terms of how baseball works as a business. And so you've got this mix, where on one hand, you got folks who, the whole just one before I die turned into, well, why hadn't it been 2 or 3, before I die? Like one wasn't enough now. And so there's just a more visceral kind of psychological, or not even psychological, emotional desire for the team to be better and to have done better than what it did. And that's totally understandable. And then on the other hand, there's this kind of more pragmatic, like, look, this is one of the top revenue teams in the game. Even though the payroll is fine, it should be better. They should be able to spend more. They should be competitive. They should not need to rebuild again. That's already happened. Why is all this money going into the ballpark and the neighborhood and not the ball club? And so you have a lot of that, and it's all, I think it's all understandable, but it's just this kind of waiting game now, where it's like, look, I would consider the Cubs to be, a lot of people want to talk about the Yankees and Dodgers. I think they're more comparable to the Red Sox, for a number of different reasons, right? We could look at various parallels there, but I think part of the problem is, like, the Red Sox, they had a couple times where they had to tear things down, but I mean, they went from like last place in the division to winning a World Series the next year.
Yeah.
And so it's like, once they did a full on rebuild, they were able to retool on the fly much more quickly. And I think that's the issue, whether you're coming at it analytically or emotionally. The issue is not that the Cubs haven't won another World Series, because I think we can all realize how difficult that is to do in the first place. So doing it again is that much worse. But why haven't you been able to do this quicker? Why is it taking so long? Why is this not working as smoothly as it probably should? So that was a really protracted answer to the question, but I think it does it. I guess the big issue though is in how fans handle it, and there's a lot of blame to be thrown around, and that's where it gets down to like the nuances of it. Like, you can be pissed about it, but like, let's look at the right things here, and let's also apply a little bit of context and think about how it's going to work. So again, we'll see, but it's tough when everybody's pissed about something at pretty much all points. Like, there's not been a prolonged streak of everybody being like, oh, this is actually fun baseball. So,
I brought you on here today to kind of talk, now that the smoke has cleared from the trade deadline, which, we can touch a little bit on how early it feels based on, how the playoffs are now structured, like having a hard transaction stop in July, and whether or not that's appropriate going forward. But yeah, I think the Cubs made some moves not necessarily, buy moves, not sell moves. I think, as a fan base, we landed so hard on like this definitive answer on like what the trade deadline was going to be that, I always try to think of like what Theo used to talk about, like every transaction period is sacred. And was an opportunity for Jed to continue to try to, the phrase I like that you said earlier is thread the needle, which is, yeah, he's decorating a pig with lipstick and saying that this isn't a rebuild, but the amount of time it has taken to get to nearish 500 baseball would imply strongly it is a rebuild, because there just hasn't been enough competitive baseball. But what are your thoughts on, the moves that they did do, and do you think it was enough, and what would you have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, and I think the point you brought up there, I mean, to me, it makes no sense to have maintained when you had a, late July trade deadline and then a late August waiver trade deadline. Like, why not if you're going to make a one hard deadline, why not put it in the middle of August? Split the difference between the two, give them more time, because now that they've got the draft right there at the All-Star break, you're basically like, the front offices have only maybe 2 weeks because they got to put their attention on the draft, understandably so. There's so little time. And that was the one thing that I feared, was because Jed Hoyer tends to be, again, a very, I don't want to say plotting, but maybe methodical. One could say conservative, right? Like, he doesn't typically, and I guess I'll probably contradict myself in a second, but I guess that's why I said typically, make those aggressive kind of, he won't do like a knee-jerk kind of a thing.
Sure.
And so that's what I worried about, right? If the more, and he talked about that a lot at Cubs convention this past January, going into, how difficult it is to make trades work. Like, we see it from once it's happened, but like how many moving pieces there are. Trades are so much more difficult to actually make work on both sides, or three sides in some cases, right? If you have multiple teams involved. So when you cut that short, naturally you're going to limit the number of transactions you can make. That said, I do feel like the move to get Isaac Paredes was very aggressive, yes. Right? To move Chris Morel, that was an un-Jed Hoyer-like move. However, and this is where the needle threading comes in, and this is where I kind of, I think everybody knew Chris Morel was not the answer at third base and was not going to be, and that's fine, but there were some other spaces there. So by, effectively just the flip-flopping, I mean, they were both guys, Cubs got them both in the same international free agent signing class, at the same age, right? Controllable. Yes. Yeah. So to me, it was somewhat lateral, and we saw, earlier this week, and Paredes had a really good game, 3-run homer into the basket, but his offensive profile has, to me, a much more limited ceiling than what Morel's did, although he's also got a much, much higher floor because of that same profile and his better defense. So you look at that, but where I look at it is the ripple effect of, you've now locked up third base. Shortstop's clearly locked up for a while. Second base is locked up, and a lot of the thought was after that, then the next move would be Horner.
Yeah.
And so by having all three of those, particularly second and third, you now have two guys who just got promoted to AAA, one of whom was far delayed over what I think it should have been in Matt Shaw, although James Triantos had been tearing up AA as well. So
yes,
you've got two guys now at AAA who effectively, unless you're going to DH them or rotate people around a lot, which doesn't make sense, because why would you have traded for a guy to then do all that? But that's the part, I guess, where, and I've written this a few times, largely about the trade itself, but I'm now more concerned. That trade, to me, the jury, in my opinion, is out. My specific jury internally, that's what I'm saying. Not that I think everybody else's should be, but my opinion is going to be somewhat under wraps until we know what happens with Shaw and with Triantos. And when you look at the outfield, who knows what Cody Bellinger does, but let's assume. I mean, now the dude's out again with the messed up hammy. We don't know what happens there. You've got two guys on the corners who are locked up for the next couple years and have no trade clauses. It's going to be very difficult to move them, even if they wanted to. And now again, you have not only Owen Casey, but Kevin Alcantara has now been promoted to AAA. The Cubs have their top 7 prospects. When we add Cade Horton into the mix as well, and then Moises Ballesteros, they're all at AAA. You can't hold those guys there at the top level of the minors for 2 more years. They're going to have to be moved. Either multiple of them will have to be moved for that stud controllable proven commodity at the MLB level, or you're flipping your MLB guys out of there and making room for the rookies. So that's the part that the deadline, to me, they didn't move a Mike Tauchman. They didn't move Drew Smiley. They didn't get rid of some of these guys who you felt like, hey, if it's really, as Jed said, if it's really about 25 and beyond and not 24, there are a ton of dudes on this roster who are very obviously not going to be a part of that quote unquote next great Cubs team. So why not move, even if the value that you're getting in return is not, it doesn't match up with what was on your spreadsheet, right? With what the algorithm spit out.
Yeah.
I think there's value to be had in giving these guys, clearing up 40-man spots, moving those dudes onto the roster, getting up into some major league experience and letting them see, because one way or the other, you got to figure that out. So again, I apologize, as I always do, for rambling on and on and on, but my thought on the deadline is that they clearly they could not have done enough. It was impossible.
Yeah.
We were saying this, 2 months ago, to have done enough to make this team a true contender. But I also don't feel like they did enough to really pave the way for what's going to happen next year and in 2026. And so that's my problem, is I feel like Hoyer just kind of shifted some things around a little bit and kind of, made it appear as if there was motion, a forward momentum, even though it was really just motion and kind of running in place. So I don't know. I have to wait to see what happens, but if I'm really looking at it, the best thing I can say is I'm disappointed. I wanted more one way or the other, and I just feel like they kind of, again, ran in place.
Yeah, I think there's, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think I was encouraged by the Morel move because it felt out of the norm. And I feel like we could argue that the norm hasn't been working. And it did feel like the first time in a while, and we'll see what the Rays do with him and if it comes back to haunt us. But it feels like they got value for something that was, yes, the upside is there. And I loved watching Christopher Morel when he was really locked in play, but the defensive concerns, defensive run saves, he's the worst third baseman in baseball. And
one of the worst defenders overall.
Yeah.
He's not even just third, just like he's bad.
And it does solve a unique issue of, it had become evident that, say, Suzuki has to be a DH. And you had to kind of pick where you were going to have the bad defense each night. And now with, Cody Bellinger being injured, you've kind of had to pick him being in the outfield as Bellinger has been playing the DH. But I felt like it was one of what I wanted was more moves to kind of clarify what you're saying, like how this roster fits, because it's messy. It is so messy. There's indecision all over the place. And it feels like now in hindsight, the Happ and Horner extensions feel unnecessary as we sit here and wonder what Shaw and Triantos and Casey and how they fit in. But they were terrified, I think, to lose Happ in the free agency and what looked like a potentially thin, offensive trade market or free agent market last year, besides, Bellinger and then a few other guys that, ended up signing these weird Boris-esque deals of, short incentives and 1-year terms, JD Martinez, and lock him up for what he is. But that no trade clause makes him hard to move. Seiya Suzuki, hard to move. Nico Horner has probably the most value, but I think he's not exactly what people thought he would be offensively. He's not really taken that next step. as people would want. The approach is pretty solid. The walk rate is weirdly up, and but yeah, not lifting the ball as much as you'd want. A lot of late inning, like trying to hit the ball the other way and getting on top of it and hitting it right into the ground. Just a lot of things that I feel, there's one rumor that was circulating after the trade deadline of, the Cubs checking in with the Angels on Logan O'Hoppe for an offensive, production from the catcher position. And kind of what you said, like the lack of time, like were they so focused on some of those types of moves that like if they did not hear what they wanted on some of these other guys immediately, they just didn't pick up the phone. It feels like there was a lot of guys that could have been moved and wouldn't affect their competitiveness this year and just weren't moved. Like Talkman is one that comes to mind immediately. And I thought because of like how his contract vests that Hector Neris would be shopped and someone would be interested in one of the leaders in wins in baseball for their bullpen. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that didn't happen that were almost as surprising as Morel getting moved. I had kind of marked him as untouchable just because of Jed's adherence to not being interested in selling low. And, like, I don't think you could sell much lower. Like, obviously the offensive profile continued to be just a conundrum of, hey, like this is going to be really good if it all comes together. Look at all these stats, but it just didn't come together. And, he was banged up a bunch this year too, fouling balls off his feet and his hands and his knees. And he just kind of looked like towards the end that he really could have used like a Suzuki break, like of just not playing for a little bit. And I think like he also kind of identifies another issue I have with like them not being able to find a direction of why wasn't he introduced to third base sooner if that was the ultimate plan? Like it was like decided in spring training, he's the third baseman, even though there was conversations, at least on a fan perspective, starting in like August last year of like, hey, we don't have a third baseman. Hey, we don't have a third baseman. And then the rumors out of the Dominican League last winter where he's going to play first base. And that was like, oh, that's super interesting. And then he ended up playing third base a bunch down there, not first base. And yeah, it just makes me wonder, it's like, did they have these other plans that fell apart and then they pivoted to these, unique versions of what they are. And like, those are the things we'll never know because like, that's the only way that some of this makes sense because otherwise it doesn't. And that's the big issue I have and really see the 2025 offseason as very, very important. And I'm mildly terrified of having it be that important when Jed's on a contract year. I would like to have some clarity of what his job is. Like he's not going to Theo Epstein this and like know that there's big decisions coming and gracefully bow out to a new baseball like operations head like Theo did, which like I respected him being like, hey, like good luck, buddy. Here you decide the trade or sign Bryant, Rizzo, and all them. And maybe it was a little later than for some of those guys than it should have been. But yeah, it's a very weird offseason we're heading into. And I feel like the commentary, much like Shohei last year, is going to shift immediately to this franchise should 100% be in the financial race for Juan Soto.
Yeah, I mean, they have to be, and I think what's interesting, though, is you go back, if you recall last year when Morel spent the early part of the season down in AAA, right? And you figure, okay, could you guys have done something more with him there at third base? And then he comes up and Jed Hoyer kind of hinted at that he was going to play third base. Yeah. Because they still didn't really have, and that never really happened, and then it was kind of like, well, crap. And there's this thing I think about, like, so, and you can't really tell from seeing me, but I try to get over to the gym as often as possible. I just got to keep the dad bod in check, but, some cardio and some lifting or whatever. And I always like to listen to music. And I have headphones in, and so now I have like the Beats Pro over the ear ones that are nice. And I bought myself some AirPods to have like just kind of normal stuff. And those are not cheap. For the longest time though, I would just go on Amazon. I'd buy like these $20, $25, wireless Bluetooth, kind of some weird brand that has a name that there's no way that's a real name. It's just whatever random configuration of letters they got. And, what I found, like, they would be fine, they worked, they did the job, but then I found like I would end up spending more because then they'd go dead. Like one of them would go bad or whatever would happen, or I'd lose a little earpiece because they were crap. And so you're buying them again and again and again. And so I'm like, I don't want to spend $150 or whatever on headphones, but what I found is those have lasted for 2 or 3 years now, versus doing this. And I say that to say this, which is that I feel like Jed Hoyer, we can look at this roster all day and say, man, $225 million, they're not cheap.
Yeah.
But Hoyer has assembled a roster largely of the cheap headsets that I was buying, headphones that I was buying. Right? They're fine, but it's like he's more driven by getting value in his signings, in his trades, in whatever, right? Like perceived value now. Right. And that's what kept the Cubs away from Bryce Harper. And so that's not just the front office, that's ownership as well, and how much money is freed up at the moment. That's Ohtani was probably never going to be a thing. I tend to believe that Soto is just going to stay in New York, and that they'll give him more money than anybody. But that's where I have a concern is that, and again, we could talk about that with the trade deadline. We could talk about that with the guys they drafted. We could look at how they're promoting people. I feel as if the pursuit of value, I mean, that's why they did, you talked about the extensions with Happ and Horner, because they could get good value in them. Like it was a deal that made sense financially at the moment, maybe more so than if you're truly looking down the road at how that's going to work.
Yeah.
Right. Knowing who maybe else would be coming up. And so that's where I look at this team as I go forward. And I just wonder, because at a certain point that, again, just like with my headphones, that pursuit of value leaves you with a bunch of just crap that goes in your junk drawer that gets thrown out. Right. Yeah. And then you just having to restart all over again. And that's where I think being able to pull the trigger and really make that move, like when we look at what the Red Sox did, and they had that bloated payroll, and they had Adrian Gonzalez and Carl Crawford and all those guys, and they ended up, clearing them all out. And it was like, oh my God, you had to eat a ton of money to do that and move on and really retool. But the Cubs, to me, feel like, with the exception of like those were just big name players on bloated contracts. But I mean, to an extent, when you look at Bellinger, looks kind of like he's in that same boat right now. If he can't stay healthy and he doesn't stick around, where do you go? What if these guys are all there, but then you have these young dudes coming up, but if the young dudes come up, and here's my other problem, who do they have? Right, when the Cubs struck it so well with Rizzo, who came up, Anthony Rizzo was the leader. He was the star. He was the face. Then you could bring all those young guys up because you had, and then, you got your John Lester. You had these proven veteran leaders, guys who were going to take the heat, guys who were going to talk to the media, guys who were going to show people the ropes. I'm not saying Happ isn't that guy or what, or Swanson's not that guy, but I mean, they're not. Yeah. Those aren't the stars. Those aren't the guys who sit there and then clear a path for these rookies to come up and be able to play and be themselves, right, without much worry for what's going to go on. And that's what concerns me, is there are no superstars. And I look, a lot of people, I'm not as high on Owen Casey as a lot of people are. I'm really high on Shaw, but as high as I am on any of them, none of those guys are Chris Bryant.
No,
not even. They're not. There's no Javi Baez there. There's no Chris Bryant there. The Cubs do not have those dudes who I could look at and be like, yes, you should have been up in the majors a week after you were drafted, and you're going to be a stud from the jump, and you're going to be this guy who's winning awards and carrying them to a World Series. I just don't see that, and that is concerning to me because I feel like they're in that middle again. So. How do you do that? Like, getting Juan Soto would sure as hell make it work, but hey,
exactly. And that's if we want to like throw the words right back in his face, it fits the timeline. And hey, like look at, I would urge Jed Hoyer, who's probably a huge fan of this podcast and listens all the time.
He told me he was.
Yeah. Like look at Bryce Harper's contract now, AAV. It's incredible value.
Yep.
he's making less money than Dansby Swanson is this year. Like, that's just insane.
And for the next several years.
Yes.
The next 5 years, Swanson will make more money than Bryce Harper.
Like, I know the payroll is a frustrating thing for a lot of folks, and there's a lot of money coming off, but like, look at the junk drawer headphones issues that are actually limiting their ability to spend if they're using that, first level as the cap. Like $13 million between Trey Mancini and Yan Gomes of dead money, $3.2 million to pay Tucker Barnhart not to be in baseball. Like, you paid Drew Smiley $11 million to be depth for your starting rotation, and now he's a lefty specialist sort of out of the pen. It's just a lot of money. I'm not going to take a dump on Kyle Hendricks' contract because of how much I love him. But, that's $16 million, and we'll see how much is really left in the tank and what he is going to be for this team going forward. I think there's probably some challenging conversations. He's either going to have to decide if he wants to continue the pitch or if the Cubs will pay him very, very little money to come back, or if he'll pursue something else, or he'll just be done. I'm not sure. Like, the health of his shoulder and all the things around that are interesting, but he's really turned his season around. And like, I don't think a lot of folks thought that was going to be possible. Like, he has been a very effective starting pitcher. But yeah, it's, they have a lot of money coming off the books. They don't have a lot of money committed going forward. It just feels like this needs to be the time. And, Jed had to throw in that zinger to like just blow up all my dreams of him saying like he knows he's conservative and would be the least likely to sign some of these mega contracts. But yeah, if I want to hear this offseason, by the end of the offseason, either Juan Soto, who is a Cub, or the Cubs were a very serious bidder but did not win him over, because like, it shouldn't be getting Juan Soto or a bust. Like, this is like a very minimum and embarrassing level of be in the conversation at minimum. Like, just be in the conversation, because we might be at a point where we need to convince people to come to this team again because of how not competitive they've been for a number of years. But like, if you're not at the table, you don't know what it takes to land guys like this. And that is a huge concern. But
yeah. And what's a bigger concern to me is that just like last year with Ohtani, it was Ohtani and then a giant gap.
Yes.
To the next. Which is understandable. But the same thing goes for this coming offseason. It's like, it's Juan Soto and then what, like Santander, Bregman,
Sasaki or from Japan might come over. It's not clear.
But like, is that a guy? But like, again, that's not. That dude doesn't have the gravitas.
Correct.
He's not, like, he might end up being awesome. Again, you look at Shota Imanaga, that was great. Again, tremendous value signing that the Cubs basically got because everybody else apparently got scared off by $100 million price tag that wasn't real in the first place.
They were busy bidding on injured Yamamoto.
yeah, exactly, right? Like, waiting for that to go crazy. But that's my concern is, again, even if they're in it for him, but then the thing is, if they don't end up getting him, there's no place to pivot to. And then if you did have the money set aside for that, although I look at that in a similar fashion to Ohtani, where I said, and I think this was correct, right? They did have something earmarked for him, nowhere near what the Dodgers were going to do, but he's a different animal entirely. Like, you would pay more for him. You don't just say, hey, we've got $500 million, and if we don't sign him, we're allocating that to other people. That's just not the way it works, because he himself drives more revenue. Soto's not at that level just because nobody is, like, nobody ever has been. But
there's a lot of
the same situation.
It's the same things at play, like jersey sales, like ad revenue. There's things beyond the contract. Associating his brand with your team in perpetuity has so much value. And the Cubs don't have, like, they don't have a top 50 jersey sale. And like, that is hurting their revenue, because when they were running like that, there's no revenue sharing agreement in baseball, not to the extent of other sports. Like, Cubs jerseys, the money goes to the Cubs, and them not selling jerseys of a specific player is revenue lost. Like, then that's like, if this is all about making money, Like maybe that's the signs we bring to Wrigley Field for games as the season goes on.
Yeah, because who's there on the team that you can guarantee will be there in even 2 years or 3 or 4? And who's look, man, Dansby Swanson, like he's I would say fine, but like his wife's a more popular athlete than he is, which is not a knock. I mean, she's phenomenal, she's fantastic. That's not a knock on her at all, but it's just like, in Chicago, she's the better of the two of them.
I mean,
right?
He's at the top level, one of the best players in the world in her sport, and he's a very good player.
He's very good, but he's not selling jerseys like Michael Bush should be around, but Michael Bush is not selling. Yeah, there's nothing sexy about any of these guys. Like Ian Happ he's fine. He's a very good baseball player. The Cubs are a team filled with good to very good players. There are no great players.
No.
None that even approach that. And then and again, I look at, there are a lot of young guys coming up that I think could be pretty good. But if I think Matt Shaw, again, I am not thinking about a guy who's going to be able to just sell out his jersey there at the Cubs store, right? Like that's just not it. There isn't any Owen Casey. Nope. Cool. I mean, you're a ginger. That's fun. But like, whatever, not to mention the fact that those jerseys are insanely expensive. Now they got the Motorola patches on them. And that's even more like as dumb as I say, and I don't care about the patch personally. No, and a lot of people don't, but I do kind of feel like, okay, if you're going to get me to buy this overpriced, crappy manufactured Nike jersey by Fanatics.
Yeah. Thanks, Fanatics.
I'm going to have a reason. Right? Like I would rather spend, I took my son up there. We went to Ryan Sandberg's statue and that was a different story. But like I spent $300 on one of those Mitchell and Ness throwbacks. That's a Sandberg because it's not the ones that they're making now. No, right? Like that's why I did it.
High quality. Yeah. Like
yes.
They feel like, yes, I still think they're a little too expensive, but like I would rather buy that. Like it's not a close race. Like it's
like, and I know, and you know what? There's no name on the back. Not that there needs to be, because now his number's retired. We know who it is. I have the blue one. I got that years ago. This was the white pinstripe one. Yeah. But like, I know that's never going to change. Like that's always going to be Ryan Sandberg. There is no difference there. And so if you have, and that's where you go to, like, there's, not that you're going to sign a dude for 10 years and $400 million, $500 million just because he'll sell jerseys to some 45-year-old man. But if he's under contract for that long and that's going to carry him to the end of his career, you can invest emotionally and financially in that player as a fan, right? Same thing with Harper. Like Bryce Harper he wanted a 13-year deal with no opt-outs because he specifically wanted to be a leader, to form a culture in that place and to set down roots with his family there. If you are willing to do that, again, that's just a big deal. Look at John Lester and look at how beloved he was. And again, this is a guy who obviously had a track record, had a legacy prior to the Cubs, but came and did, certainly to a similar fashion, not as much money, not as much time, but to say, I'm going to plant my flag here. Yeah. And I'm going to make this team a winner, and again, a lot of people talk so much trash about Jason Hayward, and I understand how that worked out. They talk about how bad the contract was, but that's foolishness that we can say in hindsight, because he got bigger offers. He was getting $200 million offers from the Cardinals, from the Nats. The Cubs got him for less, and he was the top position player, free agent of that market, and not to the extent that Juan Soto is, but he was the top guy. He was very coveted.
Yes, he was.
And that was a very similar move, right? I'm coming here. Ben Zobrist came, and so you see this when you get a dude.
Starlin Castro's controllable contract to ensure that Ben like that. These are the moves I'm waiting for. Like this is, and they're primed to do that because for exactly what you said, they have 7 top 100 prospects, and I don't think any one of them is a, pun intended, marquee player. So trade them. Let someone else think they're valuable and get guys that can stay here, that have star power. Like go to the Blue Jays and ask about Bichette or Guerrero. Like, and then free up spots on this field for the guys you want. And I feel like that's probably why they're all at AAA. I think we're in like the final countdown of I don't know if they're going to necessarily make it all the way up here. And like, to me, the only two potential untouchables are Horton, because I think there's some interesting upside. I'm concerned about health with pitchers always, and Ballesteros, because I think the hitting profile is so interesting, but if he can stick at catcher is a concern. But besides that, like, I think the rest of them are very good players, but not at all what this team needs. And what they need is, like, go sign Juan Soto and then use these other these pieces to move. Maybe you can move salary off and like use one of these young kids if that's what you want to do instead. But like, doing that is an indicator of something completely different, and that's what I hope we're seeing this offseason. But
yep,
yeah, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. And I probably could talk for several more hours on trying to dissect the emotional and decisions or non-emotional decisions of our president of baseball operations. But Evan, where can people find you besides Cubs Insider? Where are you at in socials?
Yeah, so over on X, it's just at D Evan Altman, and that's pretty much about it. I mean, I guess I've got, I'm on Facebook, but that's pretty much all just random family photos, and I'm on Instagram, same handle at D Evan Altman, but again, pretty much it's that and Facebook are just like cat pictures, and then Twitter's just me complaining about different things. So
there you go. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully you come back soon.
I'll see what I can do.
This has been another recording of Bricks Behind the Ivy. Thank you so much for listening. If you are listening to this, make sure you review. If you're on the podcast network, make sure to leave 5 stars and a review. And hey, if you leave your email address, maybe I'll contact you with a special prize. Also, if you're not watching on YouTube, please watch on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, comment, share, tell all your friends, support BBTI, as we have big plans here, and the more people that follow, the easier it will be for us to achieve these things. So check it out today. Also, do you like my shirt? Yes, there's Bricks Behind the Ivy swag now. So check out the links in the bio for our Etsy store that has all our swag. We got t-shirts, we got zips, we got polo shirts, bumper stickers, laptop stickers, coffee mugs, blankets, canvas prints, everything that you'd want Bricks Behind the Ivy, even a bleacher tank that says Bleacher Brickhead. Too cool for school, guys. But check that out today and help support Bricks Behind the Ivy. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week, and go Cubs!